Good morning and welcome, everyone. I'm very happy to see all of you here. This is the panel where Zoe Wicomb would have presented her work. We have therefore decided to have this panel as a tribute to Zoe and to her life and work. And we are very, very lucky to have some eminent experts on South African literature and on the work of Zoe Wicomb present today. So I will only do a very short introduction to our speakers. Then Dorothy Driver will actually integrate an introduction to Zoe Wicomb's life and work in her presentation, and we will follow with the other presentations. And after that, we have a number of people who have contacted me and who will also speak about Zoe's work. But all of you are, of course, welcome to share your reading experiences, your memories, your friendships in this seminar. So we have Professor Dorothy Driver, whom you all know as the professor of English at the University of Cape Town, and who is now affiliated with the University of Adelaide in Australia, who is a very knowledgeable and eminent critic of South African literature, women's writing, and especially also Zoe Wicomb's work. We then have Habiba Badiroon, who is a fellow South African writer, but also professor at Penn State University, and chair of the board of New Contrast. And you can speak to Habiba also about this initiative or the work with New Contrast. And we have David Atwell, who is professor at the University of York, but also has a professor extraordinaire at University of Western Cape. And so you can see that we have these very strong connections to both South Africa and to universities abroad, which is quite interesting and important here. And David Atwell is, of course, as you all know, also a very important critic of South African literature and also of Zoe Wicomb's work. So I will now give over to Dorothy Driver.
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you to Maria, to Tina, and to everyone else, Louise, for the invitation. It's an absolute honor and pleasure to be here. Zoe Wicomb was born in Little Namaqualand in 1948, the year the apartheid government came into power, born to a mother whose last name was Lafleur, marking her French Huguenot heritage, and to a father whose last name, Wicomb, testified to his Scottish heritage. Her father, a schoolmaster in an Afrikaans-speaking medium community, sent her to an English medium school in Cape Town, after which she received her first degree at the University of the Western Cape, which was Afrikaans medium. And then she repeated that degree, the BA, as getting a second BA in England at Reading University in the early 1970s. Although she had made a marriage a convenience to a British citizen for the sake of a British passport, she entered a long-term relationship with the then budding photographer and artist Roger Palmer, now acclaimed, and embarked on her literary and academic career. The cultural boycott against apartheid South Africa meant that she could make only the briefest, surreptitious return visits to her home country until the first democratic elections in 1994. And thereafter, family concerns, her Scottish daughter and then 3 grandsons, limited the time that she could spend in South Africa, although she taught for a while at the University of the Western Cape and made other extended Cape visits. In the course of these movements, back and forth between her 2 homes, Glasgow and the Cape, her writing developed what she called a shuttling movement between the two, looking at the Cape with the eyes of an outsider even with what we may think of as an anthropological eye, and then also developing into what has become a familiar post-colonial response in which the centre becomes the margin, with Glasgow itself becoming her anthropological object, even while the two are strangely bound together historically and figuratively. This back and forth movement, the shuttling, this in-between position, to and fro, as she's called it, serves also as a more general descriptive for her writing. Wicomb published her first book in 1987, an interconnected set of short stories, which some critics have likened to a fragmented novel, entitled You Can't Get Lost in Cape Town. A young woman's coming to age in an environment marked by the effects of colonization, apartheid, and displacement. The book makes two fundamental assertions about place. First, via close and loving descriptions of Cape vegetation, and secondly, via allusions to the prior presence of South Africa's indigenous people. The latter are symbolically represented in the opening story by scores of children who squat, unseen, behind the Ghana bushes when the white government inspector comes to visit, some of them taking the opportunity to empty their bowels, as the text politely puts it. The plant references are part of a larger set of environmental descriptors in which the very land and sometimes the sky seem to speak. Wicomb's next book, David's Story, was published in 2000. The gap of 13 years explained partly by the fact that she was also pursuing an academic career, which I'll say a little bit more about later. The novel deals in part with the complex history of the Griqua people, her family legacy, anti-apartheid resistance, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, through which was brought to light not just some of the horrors of the apartheid years, but also the hitherto hidden violence within the resistance movement. Here too, as in You Can't Get Lost in Cape Town, a key claim made in the book is the prior presence and land claim of South Africa's indigenous people. One of the central characters, Andries Lafleur, brings to our attention the amazed eyes of those who stand on the strand of that double-named place, the Cape of Storms, the Cape of Good Hope, watching the arrival of the first Dutch ships. The written histories that have come down to us have so far failed, as Lafleur points out, to record that site through indigenous eyes. So this is a gap that Wicomb starts to fill in. There's a further point to be made about place. Wicomb began writing the novel David's Story soon after she had returned to the Cape to cast her first vote in the democratic elections in 1994. Her return visit occasioned a largely joyful and optimistic essay, but at the end she voices anxiety about what she saw so rightly as a fragile democracy. She poses some key questions. How will military values acquired during the struggle be converted to civic values? Why does no one address this crucial aspect of reconstruction? Is the military not overrepresented in the new cabinet? Why is this so? Why is the obscenity of the apartheid government reproduced in the fantastic salaries drawn by our new members of parliament, while our streets are filled with homeless beggars? How long can we expect ordinary South African people to wait patiently for a better life? But then, more optimistically, referring to what she saw as the ANC's firm commitment to mass education and raising levels of literacy, she imagines the creation of another generation of readers and writers, one that would now be attentive to the central position of irony and paradox in all aspects of our culture. David's Story is, in the deepest sense, an urgent call for close attention, for continual interrogation of one's environment, political, cultural, economic, and the discourses that represent it, and create it as what is then denominated as reality. Moreover, David's story asserts, in the face of a developing black South African nationalism, what the novel calls the mixture of Malayan, Madagascan slave, French missionary, and Khoisan hunter blood of one of its central characters, in the interest of interrogating a nationhood that threatens to be based on exclusion rather than inclusion, proposing instead a place where the boundaries of national identities, national selves, are dissolved as a new non-nation is engendered and born, a nation that is not a nation, a race that is not a race, an ethnicity that transcends ethnicity, paradoxical as all this sounds. As I mentioned earlier, Zoe was also a distinguished academic. She taught at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, producing from the early 1990s essays, conference papers, and keynote addresses across the world. Most of these have been gathered into a book called Race, Nation, and Translation, edited by Andrew van der Vlies and published by Yale University Press. Like other major South African writers, such as Njabula Ndebele, Nadine Gordimer, John Coetzee, her fictional and critical concerns are visibly intertwined, perhaps even more palpably than in the case of the two white writers. This gives her fiction a particularly sharp critical edge. Apart from international success as a fiction writer, she won, as we all know, have heard, the esteemed Wyndham Campbell Literature Prize in 2013, for instance, with a citation that mentioned her subtle, lively language and beautifully crafted narratives that explore the complex entanglements of home and the continuing challenges of being in the world. Apart from that, she was also, as van der Vlies points out, among South Africa's most significant literary critics and public intellectuals, dealing with race, identity, and gender politics, I'm quoting, the politics of memory and nostalgia and the nature of the archive, the lessons of linguistics and critical theory for reading, writing, and teaching. This list is extended. She also addressed questions of genre, the politics of representation, the role of intertextuality in cultural formation, the cultural and political importance of polyphony, the recovery of the voices of minor, neglected, or disparaged peoples, and perhaps above all, the importance of close reading, close attention to ambiguity, irony, nuance, uncertainty. Had she been able to attend this conference, she would have presented a paper on the South African writer Ivan Vladislavich and the Zambian writer Namwali Serpell, who won the Caine Prize for Literature for a short story called The Sack. Her absence is our loss. It's hard to bear the thought of never seeing her or hearing her again. But we can read and reread her. After David's story in 2000, she published Playing in the Light in 2006, a study of the play White, a further collection of short stories called The One That Got Away in 2008, a novel called October in 2014, dealing with the complexities of dual belonging, the Cape and Glasgow, against a background of domestic trauma and still life into 2020. Of particular interest to this conference would be her continued interest in how the past is to be remembered and how counter-memories might emerge, though always themselves to be scrutinized, as well as in the temptations and dangers of new nationalisms, new exclusions, new orthodoxies. But let me say a last word about her interest in place. The writing of Africa, her Africa, is crucial to her lifelong project. In the words of one of her characters, Africa brings the richness of posing new problems and new ways of thinking. Creative writing of the kind that she does, she says, is like cultivation, the cultivation of a garden. To expand on that wonderful quotation that Maria used earlier, writing needs no more than a stick and the earth God has given for the sowing of seeds. Writing is no less than cultivation and growth. The more you write, the more there is to write, as if the words themselves come bursting through the earth like so many seedlings. Thank you.
Thank you, Dorothy. That was absolutely wonderful.
Lovely, thank you.
Now I welcome Habiba.
Sorry, I was quite controlled until that moment. Where to begin? Zoe, always in these moments, would be preceded by her magnificent performances before the microphone, by having to confront the cursed torture of writing and presenting. But in rereading her work in the last few weeks, I found that there was a play across her many pieces. For instance, if you, like me, entered the mystery of still life, wondering what had been written in this very place, again, confronting the agony that writing always is, then you would have started also by observing the careful description of that gold-colored foil that diverts her a little bit from the impossibility of answering the question of where to begin. And of course, if you remember also this gold and red cellophane that touches like butterflies on her earlier works, from You Can't Get Lost in Cape Town to David's story that Dorothy has so wonderfully conjured for us here, you'll see that actually when she did navigate that agony, that she produced something that is going to reward our rereading over these many years. So I will tell you that when I encountered Zoe's work in the 1990s, and I encountered her in person, I remember seeing her in what was then called Jamison Avenue at the University of Cape Town, speaking to somebody I will not name, but I saw her in the distance, and that's where I kept her. Because what I saw was somebody who was ablaze. She was blazing with a light that she wrote about so gloriously across these many books. And I had to keep her there, because somehow she did have within herself a sense of an inherent permission to write what was impossible. So she wrote at that moment of a national frame in a way that was utterly non-national, utterly refused the alluring, always betraying, receding promise of the nation. And how did she dare? I did ask her that question once, and she fortunately didn't even try to answer it because it's so ridiculous. Because how do you explain that you inherently have the permission to do the impossible? So I had to keep her at a distance for a long time. And now, when she is, that other thing she wrote about so beautifully, absence. If you look once again across her earth, and even in this magnificent book that is David's story, at her writing on absence, the absence that is within the face of a black-eyed Susan, for instance, which describes as devolving to a point of invisibility, of nothingness. I feel she's given us a little bit of a rehearsal about how to deal with the absence of her that is now an always absence. And in thinking about that, thinking about endings and thinking about beginnings, I'm also comforted because when she did begin, finally, that thing that was always receding, which was how to start the book, she never started at the beginning. And she never ended with a conclusion, because she was always pointing to the way that the present is always preceded by something of a prehistory that is inside of it. So within her deliberations on absences and on beginnings is something I think of permanent and infinite value for those of us who are still struggling with this question of the nation today, and are still struggling with the question of who belongs within it, who can be seen within it, and who has the permission within it. And so I think I will leave you with her words, and also with this deliberation, which Dorothy also alluded to. I think she was always so ahead of us in how she wrote and in what she wrote about. And I, as a reader, and perhaps many of us as readers, are always catching up with that project of exactly what it was that she elicited from us in terms of understanding the world in the sufficient complexity and the difficulty that the world presents to us. So I'm always catching up with that. And I read her, I think, very partially and very amateurishly, despite the fact that I was supposed to have been doing my PhD at that time. But I remembered picking up a track along her short stories and then the novels. And this was the track that I eventually concluded a piece in my PhD about, which was about this idea of death and the boundaries between us, that she explores so beautifully between the characters of David and Dulcie, who both touch and do not touch in the story, in David's story. And there's a moment where she writes about the way that Dulcie dies and the way that David dies. And it is along a piece of road that those of you who have spent a lot of time, or even just a little bit of time in Cape Town, might find familiar, which is Chapman's Peak Drive. So I will read you a little bit of that, and then perhaps leave some time for us to talk some more about all of your memories as well. In the novel, Dulcie, who has fought in the armed struggle, is being tortured by unknown people who have captured her and who may terrifyingly be her own comrades. And to survive the torture, which is very precise and yet described with a delicacy that never actually brings us before the replication of violence that so often descriptions of torture give to us. To survive this violence, Dulcie has the following imagining. And so each morning as they leave, as a matter of pride and despair, she summons all her strength to get dressed and drive to the sea. Along the coastal road, she drives at breakneck speed, with the sea roaring below, and slows down only for the baboons who have, through the early hours, come to think of the road as their own. They scurry by with little ones clinging to their backs, the males snarling defiantly by the roadside, and only then would the voice recede. Would she wake from the trance, only yards before the beckoning bend in the road, to remember that she will resist, as she has done all her life. She likes to believe that it is the moment, she likes to believe that it is the thought of David that resurrects her at that moment. And then from David, the view coming round the bend at Chapman's Peak would have been breathtaking before dawn, at that darkest hour, the bewitched hour when those bewildered by the worlds they have shaped touch the amulets around their necks and grind their teeth. There would have been no baboons, no cars parked in the lay-by, no lone figure firing a camera at the picturesque water and towering rock, no need to slow down at all. There are tire marks of a screeching halt, as if he had decided only at the last minute to stop. There is a note on top of the pile of carefully folded clothes on the passenger seat. It is for Sally and the children. There is no explanation, only an apology and an assurance of his love. So I want to stop in that lay-by, and a lay-by is a wonderful South African word for a little hook in the road, especially a curving mountain road, where you can pull off while somebody else passes you, or you can stop for a moment to look at the sea. The lay-by is also one of those wonderful moments that crosses her many books. So it's in that lay-by. And what is coming, and what has come before, that I think I'm watching Zoe blazing in the distance as I first met her. Thank you.
Thank you, Habiba, for sharing those very perceptive and beautiful readings.
What will we do without Zoe's mordant humor and creative energy? These were the words of our friend and colleague Derek Attridge, also a STIAS Fellow, on hearing the news of Zoe's death. Since then, Derek has written 2 moving obituaries, in The Conversation and in The Guardian, and a further obituary has since appeared in the New York Times. The sadness of this news has been overwhelming, combined with disbelief, just as much as if a loved friend, a much admired and loved friend, had met with a heavy accident. Zoe left us on full power. Unprepared, we've become aware of just how much Zoe and her work have sustained us in ways that we are now required to explain. Zoe's wit and flair have been celebrated in an outpouring of anecdotes. Among her former colleagues at UWC, where she taught in the early 1990s, I think experimenting with the possibility of return. She was our colleague there for 3 years. Mickey Flockerman reminded us of Zoe pushing back the chairs and getting everyone dancing at end-of-year staff parties. Of Zoe in her yellow Morris Minor, the car chosen because it matched a stylish dress, quixotically navigating the dangerous Moerdam Road and the N2 highway. Of Zoe in a lecture remarking to a student who was sneaking out early, "What, am I boring you already?" There are many such anecdotes, and long may they continue. They are vivid, celebratory, and consoling. It might be too soon to talk about Zoe's literary legacy when we have scarcely come to terms with her death. At least we can comfort ourselves, as Dorothy and Habiba have said, in the knowledge that summations are not necessary now, because this work will go on for many years. The guarantee that it will do so lies in the sheer resourcefulness of her writing. From our teaching, our supervisions, and conferences, we know how generative her work is and that it will always attract attentive readers. Some 15 years ago, feeling that the critical conversations were lagging behind the brilliance of her work, some colleagues organized a series of conferences and colloquia with Kai Easton, Derek Attridge, Meg Samuelson, Andrew van der Vlies. We organized conferences at SOAS in London, here at Stellenbosch, and at York, which led to special issues of various journals, the Journal of Southern African Studies, Safundi, and Current Writing, and then a collection of essays, Zoe Wicomb and the Translocal, Writing Scotland and South Africa, which appeared in 2017. With 2 short story cycles, 4 novels, and a collection of essays, there are too many possible tracks to follow into Zoe's work. But I'd like to dwell on her last novel, Still Life, a funny and hugely ambitious work, complex in its metafictional framing. I do so partly because it began here at Stiers. It positions itself parodically in another legacy, one that is steadily disappearing from view, I think, namely that of Thomas Pringle, the poet and anti-slavery campaigner who lived in the Cape Colony for 6 years, from 1820 to 1826, and then for 8 years in London until his death in 1834. In Still Life, Wicomb brings together in her house of fiction what she calls a pondok, historical figures who were part of the Pringle household, who begin work on a biography after his death. They include Mary Prince, whose account of her life under slavery in Antigua was recorded by the women of the Pringle home, a narrative which he then edited and published at great personal and financial cost. Hinsa Marosi, the Motswana child whom Pringle and his wife Margaret adopted as their son under ambiguous circumstances. The cast also includes Sir Nicholas Green, who is imported by these characters from Virginia Woolf's Orlando to help in the writing, but who turns out to be a snobbish and imperially minded amanuensis. The biography, therefore, does not come to light, meaning that Still Life is the story of a failed fictional enterprise, a novel about a biography that isn't written, as the fictional novelist has to confess to her literary agent at the end. Still Life implies that writing the life of a settler poet and anti-slavery campaigner into contemporary decoloniality requires the strategic deployment of multiple fictional frames, metafictional frames. One of the minor characters brought in to give witness to this life is not drawn from real life at all, but from one of Pringle's poems. Fakie Faal appears briefly, without speaking, in Pringle's poem, The Emigrant's Cabin, a dialogue poem in which he tries to give an idealistic portrait of settler life. The dialogue is interrupted by an elaborate meal prepared by the servant, Fakie. She is instructed in colonial Dutch to bring the ladies in for lunch, and then Fakie speaks. Fakie does not speak in this poem. She obeys orders. In Wicomb's novel, Fakie, which is actually a diminished form of Sophia, meaning wisdom, speaks from her precisely rendered Gonakwa Koi position in the social imaginary of the colony. Wicomb not only gives speech to Sophia, she also gives her writing. And I'm going to return to the passage that Maria Olausson read for us on opening day and that Dorothy has referred to, and I'll give you a little more of it, if you don't mind. What Hinza didn't know was that Tata had in turn been teaching me to read and write, that I had already spelled out all of the Exodus story and puzzled over the strange behavior of Moses and God alike. The business of letters turned out to be not half as difficult as we were led to believe. It was certainly more pleasant than emptying piss pots. We children sang the ABC together around the fire, and Tata said that in order to write, we needed no more than a stick and the earth that God had given us for the sowing of seeds, that writing was no less than cultivation and growth. The more you wrote, the more there was to write, as if the words themselves came bursting through the earth like so many seedlings. Whilst the others didn't care to practice their ABCs, I marked out and smoothed a stride of mudbank on which to draw my letters with a sharp stick, and the beauty of it was that the crooked ones could be smoothed over. They need not live to mock me. One sweep with a stick, or even by hand, and all was erased, ready once more for an attempt at healthy, firm letters. Like any garden, the writing patch had to be maintained. He poured water oh so slowly over it, avoiding rivulets while smoothing with a flat stone, so that the muddy earth hardened evenly in the sun for a clean scoring of lines. I marked out my page by setting wee white stones all around a vast triangle prettily, with a line of even tinier stones down the center to signify the spine of a book. But that was a temporary thing. The stone borders had to go as I came to fill up the whole bank. Soon, the whole Zuurveld would be covered in my writing. When my hand grew steadier and I no longer made mistakes, I also used the large flat stones and etched with a piece of flint the words I wanted to shout out to the world, declare them forever and ever to all and sundry who should pass by these parts. And Hinze knew nothing of me, the writer. I whispered those letters that were not finely enough drawn to set in stone. I had whispered them before, after the long-awaited rainfall, standing under the buttery yellow, full-faced moon overhead, with my feet firm in the gurgling stream and the murmur of water at my toes. The stars winked and beckoned, and then I knew as my bones filled the air and grew light as a bird's, and still I know that I will never revise these words. To be free, to live and do as I please, without the bidding of a master, whether he be good or bad. I knew that one day, when my letters were perfect, I would score that in stone. How might we position such exquisite work in the wider fields, movements, disciplines, or institutions of South African, African, and possibly world literatures? What is Zoe Wicomb's contribution? Such questions also feel too large. The better question is perhaps, how are these fields of writing influenced, perhaps changed by her particular presence? I would like to quote the Chinese scholars of African literature, Zhu Zhenwu and Li Dan, who I had the pleasure of meeting recently in Shanghai and Lanzhou, who seek to explain why it was that in 2021, the Year of African Literature was born, following the award of 2 African writers in that year of the Nobel Prize, Abdul Razak Gurnah, the Booker Prize, Damon Galgut, the Prix Goncourt, Mohamed Mbougar Sarr of Senegal, and the Kamwench Prize to Pauline Giziane of Mozambique. Zhu and Li speak of the deep identification of African and Afro-descended writers with the history and culture of the African continent, their deep attachment to their homeland, the cultural quality of upholding their selfhood, remembering history, but looking to the future. These phrases are so much in keeping with the directions of this symposium. Just as importantly, Zhenwu and Li speak of such cultural expression as arising from what they call diasporicity, meaning the tensions between heterogeneous cultures, this being the most striking contemporary manifestation of Africanness. Diasporic being takes many different forms, they argue, but it is what African writers have in common. A responsibility, they say, to give local narratives a global consciousness. The harmony of decolonization is matched by the absence of uniformity, a cultural hybridity that gives African literatures a natural advantage in dialogue with the literatures and cultures of other countries. This description is entirely relevant to Zoe Wicomb's writing, especially in what has been called her translocalism between Cape Town and Glasgow, her scrupulous attention to linguistic in-betweenness and reinvention in the vernaculars of both those contexts, and also in her semiotic and aesthetic self-consciousness, which lends formal brilliance and seriousness to everything she wrote. In these particular respects, Zoe Wicomb's legacy is fully aligned with, and indeed represents, the very best in contemporary literature in Africa and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for this very illuminating talk. I would now like to call on Denise, who wanted to say something. We will move on, still keep talking about the last novel, Still Life, and here Denise wanted to draw our attention to the Caribbean connections in that novel.
Instead of coming straight home, we were hijacked by 4 writers, who I'm not going to name, who are responsible for whatever. But maybe the humor is also something I'd want to say about Zoe Wicomb, that I think her humor really plays into the kind of humor that I associate with Caribbean writing, a kind of piquant, a kind of subversive, cunning kind of humor. So I just really wanted to say 2 things, picking up on something that Maza said yesterday about rifling through the archive. And I think that's something that Zoe Wicomb does in her work really well, because there's a kind of irreverence in the way she rifles through the archive. I'm thinking of Pringle, but I'm also thinking of the way she uses the title Disgrace and plays with, Coetzee's Disgrace. I think the way she uses the figures of servants is particularly interesting, because we haven't really talked about class, but I think she's absolutely brilliant at pinpointing very particular, detailed inflections of class without speaking for. She speaks through in some way. So Grace in Disgrace, something that has stayed with me is the way Grace notices that the woman visiting from Scotland eats her breakfast standing up like a donkey. So whenever I eat my breakfast standing up, or eat anything standing up, I think of Zoe Wicomb and eating like a donkey. So there are ways in which I think her work constructs a kind of archive of the everyday and the ordinary that I think is really very, very powerful. And the other thing I wanted to say very quickly was building on what Njabulo said yesterday about thinking with the heart, or thinking feelingly. There was something about her very fierce intellectualism and her fierce theoretical approach to writing that is always mediated through feeling. So it never feels as if you're being lectured, in that kind of sort of heavy-duty theoretical way. It's always mediated through love and through feeling. So, yeah, I think that's about all I feel up to saying, but thank you.
Thank you, Denise. That was very nice. Then I want to call on Eleke. Where are you, Eleke? There you are.
Thank you very much to the others for their remarks. I had some written remarks, but I left them behind. And I think somehow it's more fitting to Zoe's spirit to be extempore. It's hardly to believe that we gathered here not only in celebration of her work, but also in valediction. I was saying to you, Maria, when she wrote to all of us whether we had memories of Zoe, that I just wanted to share an anecdote, really, that for me pinpoints something so amazing about the work of Zoe Wicomb. And I think it says something also about her writing and her approach to writing. We've heard a lot about the astonishing 4 novels, which many of us are privileged to teach and supervise. For me, in particular, David's story, and also Playing in the Light, with the complexities and ironies of identity that it unfolds. But it's in particular her skills as a short story writer that I wanted to kind of bring into the room today, because there we see Zoe's wordsmithery, which comes through in particular, we've already started to hear about that, which comes through in particular in her dialogue, those rhythms of Afrikaans that come through in the dialogue, and her absolutely unfailing sense of comic timing in the dialogue. And that came together in what, sadly was the last time I saw Zoe, which was at the Norval Foundation, the art gallery, in, I think it was February of 2022. We were there by chance. We hadn't come together to see an exhibition of African women's writers, and I was looking at some paintings on the wall, and round the corner came Zoe, and she was like a revelation. I mean, some of the obituaries have talked about her sense of style, her dress sense, but she was magnificent in those incredible dresses and her sculpted collarbones. I mean, she came around the corner and she's just absolutely beautiful. And I had been pondering, as some of you know, I'm obsessed with the stars of the Southern Hemisphere, and I'd been pondering that kind of algorithm about how to find due south without the pole star that we have in the Northern Hemisphere, and I had remembered some evenings before that Zoe has a moment in her short stories where she kind of gives us that algorithm. So I said, Zoe, you're here. It's amazing. This is a conjunction that I've just been hoping for. Zoe, what is that algorithm, and which story is it that it features in? You know what? I can't remember. I have been trying to remember. And she said, scoldingly, Elika, how can you expect me to remember my own writing? You are the reader. You should be remembering. But even as she scolded me, her hands went up and she began to measure. And some of us know it's 2 thumb lengths from the pointer stars of the Southern Cross, and then you drop a perpendicular down. And of course, as we spoke, she suddenly said, I think I gave that to Frida Shenton in You Can't Get Lost in Cape Town. And it is, of course, the closing of the final story of You Can't Get Lost in Cape Town. And it's a kind of beautiful orientation south, kind of back to Zoe's home. And I just want to read those final lines of the story is called A Trip to the Gifberge. This is Frida Shenton. I watch the stars in an ink blue sky. The Milky Way is smudged white on the dark canvas. The 3 kings flicker, but the Southern Cross drills her 4 points into the night. I find the long axis and extend it 2.5 times. Then drop a perpendicular down onto the tip of the Gifberge, down onto the lights of the Suterus winery, due south. Thank you.
Well, since there is a Swedish connection to this symposium, I'd just like to very briefly share a memory of meeting Zoe in Stockholm. I think it was in the year 2000. So at the Culture House in Stockholm, Kulturhuset, they have been running now for decades a series of talks or conversations under the heading International Authors Conversation. And I had arranged for Zoe and for Ivan Vladislavich to come to Stockholm, and they were both present there. And it was a very lively and inspiring conversation. But as you know, Zoe was always very, well, she, as we've heard, she could be, well, ironic and biting, but she was also extremely modest. And this was definitely what came through at that conversation. So this was shortly after David's story had appeared, if memory serves correctly. So the conversation revolved largely around that. And of course, I've followed her work ever since I first read it in the late 90s. And I'm, even as I share everyone's sorrow at her passing, I'm also very pleased to see that her work has gradually come to receive the recognition that it actually deserved right from the very beginning with You Can't Get Lost in Cape Town. Thank you.
When I heard that she died before I came from Nigeria, I was shattered because I was looking forward to meeting her, because I met her for the first time last year in the University of Louisville at the African Literature Association conference. That was the first time I met her. She was the keynote speaker. And when she spoke, there was a loud ovation. And as a poet, I decided to just write 2 lines for her, thinking that I would develop from my impression of her. I wrote, "A phenomenal woman, full of grace and beauty." Just those 2 lines, listening to her. So it was very painful when we received the message that she had died. I was looking forward to meeting her here. She was a great woman. At that conference, people loved her, even those of us who hadn't met her for the first time. After her lecture, we gathered around her and thanked her for being with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Akatsu.
It's with such a heavy heart that I speak today, but also with such fond and vivid memories of Zoe. I was in touch with her just 10 days before she passed away. I teach at the University of the Western Cape, and I'd written to Zoe to say that her work, just to try to give some sense of the depth of spirit of her work and the way it resonates with our students at the University of the Western Cape. And I told her that we were already planning to hold a conference on her work in 2028. And Zoe, as you know, is so shy and modest, and she said, no, you can't do that. No, it's not worth it. And then I said, Zoe, it's not for you, it's for the students. Oh, she says, then it's acceptable. So I just want to share another little memory of Zoe and read a little passage. And in a way, it links much of what we've heard today. Dorothy speaking about the opening story of You Can't Get Lost in Cape Town with the Ghana bushes, speaking about writing and the earth, about the translocal. And also, there is a little paragraph that carries on after the Southern Cross at the end of I Can't Get Lost in Cape Town. So, Habiba, you were speaking about questions of nation and how do you represent nation and how do you not represent nation or go beyond that. And in the very final story of You Can't Get Lost in Cape Town, the character Frida Shenton comes back from abroad. She visits her family in Cape Town and she gets given proteas at the airport, and she resists these proteas, and her mom says to her, come, let's go on a trip up into the Gifberge where you'll see fynbos growing there. And Frida says, oh, nonsense, you don't get fynbos up there, only on the peninsula. But they go up and there are these beautiful plants and the proteas as well. And then Frida says, oh, if you must, go and see the proteas, and then you can hoist the South African flag and sing Die Stem. And the retort is, don't be silly, it's not the same thing at all. You who are so clever ought to know that proteas belong to the veld. Only fools and cowards would hand them over to the Boers. Those who put their stamp on things may see it in their own histories and hopes. But a bush is a bush. It doesn't become what people think they turn it into. We know who lived in these mountains when the Europeans were still shivering in their own country. What they think of the veld and the flowers is of no interest to me. And they come across a fence. It's got 13 padlocks on it. They want to go to the other side of the fence to look at the view, Frida even considers scaling that fence, but they don't climb the fence. But what is surprising is the way that the proteas just grow through the fence. So they transgress the fence and grow right through on both sides of the fence. Not even 13 padlocks is enough to keep the veld out. And then just after the passage about the Southern Cross, so Frida has been saying, I hate this country, I'll never come back, I'll always stay in Europe. But then right at the end, after seeing this beautiful fynbos up in the Gifberge, and she speaking to her mother later, and she says that evening, and she takes her a cup of cocoa, and I say, I wouldn't be surprised if I came back to live in Cape Town again. Is it? She says matter-of-factly, but her eyes glow with interest. Oh, you wouldn't approve of me here either. Wasted education, playing with dynamite and all that. And then the mother replies, and this is the very last sentence of You Can't Get Lost in Cape Town. Ach man, I'm too old to worry about you, but with something to do here at home, perhaps you won't need to make up those terrible stories. Hey? And so all I can say, if Zoe's shuttling between two countries and places and different sensibilities actually didn't give her something else to do, but enabled the writing that we still have and that continues to engage us and inspire us in a way that for the students also, they're learning to speak from and gain a voice, and not only speaking about and from a distance. So thank you.
Thank you so much. So I didn't know Zoe very well, and I was intimidated, so I kept my distance. But she was at Linda's wedding. But I had to correspond with her in the lead up to this event. She needed a bit of persuading to come. But we only had met a couple of times, so I didn't think she would recognize me. But I bumped into her at the Baxter in February this year. She and Roger were attending a show that I was also attending. And I went up to her to introduce myself and said, I'm the person we've been corresponding. And I had wanted to tell her how much I loved still life and that it made me laugh out loud many times, and that's quite rare for a novel to do. but it was very awkward. The whole interaction was awkward, and I felt embarrassed, and then I was so cross with myself when I got home. It's like I couldn't tell her what I wanted to tell her, and it was awkward. So I dropped her a line and said, you know, Zoe, I'm sorry, this was really awkward, but what I really wanted to say was this. And I told her what I wanted to say. And then I got this response, which I believe is quite characteristic of her, for those of you who know her well. She said, 3 cheers for awkwardness. Better, after all, than being socially glib. As you all know, Tina, there's so much terror involved both in writing and letting it loose into the world that nice words about one's work mean a lot.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you, Tina. I will just pick up on that terror, because when I invited Zoe Wicomb to Växjö University in Sweden, and she did the readings. She was, of course, always absolutely terrified before the reading, and we went through everything, and this also has to do with the students. I said, the students are here, the students have read your work, they won't. Okay, so then it was fine, and she started reading. But afterward, I said, how odd, I do not recognize those passages that you were reading right now. And then she said, do you think I would be reading that rubbish? It was such bad writing. So I invented something totally new. So she was reading something that she had not written before. It changed everything. So, okay. So that was actually quite an amusing experience. But she did it for the students. It's when you said the students have prepared, they are here, they want to listen to you, then it was all right, and it was fine.
Calling on me. But I was there at that event with Biba and Grace, and we were laughing because she was holding that book and rereading things that were not in the book. But I've had a lot of fond memories of Zoe. The wedding was one, but yeah, the wedding, she came and didn't have a place to stay. She had a place to stay, but she chose my Rodents, the Rhodes people you will know, she chose that Savoy Hotel to stay in. I'm like, Zoe, why would you stay in this hotel? She said, oh, well, there's nothing wrong with it. We're like, we have lots of room. So, I mean, there are lots of memories that I have of Zoe, and yeah, there's just so much to say about her, and I'll really miss her.
Yes, I remember Grace and Habiba, you were also then in Växjö. And we had this wonderful conversation in the evening at the conference where she was giving us very clear advice about how to manage married life. But those things we will not share.
No, but I will share one thing. We did go shopping.
The shopping? Habiba, would you like to elaborate? Did you all go shopping?
We did. I still wear those things today. Yeah, she was really great. She also has a spectacular sense of style. This was also part of her presence, you know, that she was the opposite of an apologetic body slinking through the world. She was fully arrived and beautiful and both did not want to be looked at, but could be looked at with great pleasure. And yeah, she was the greatest company. I was so looking forward to being with her among this glorious gathering of African writers where I think she was just delighted. And so I'm sure all of us have been in touch with her to say, let's have, you know, talk and catch up and have lunch and maybe go shopping.
Yes. Yeah. Grace, you have to say something about the shopping as well.
Firstly, thank you for creating this space. It's thank you. It's helpful for all of us, I think. And it's beautiful. And it's just amazing to see and hear all these different faces and images of Zoe. And yeah, it's just wonderful. And so I've got an anecdote about shopping, actually. And yes, she's a brilliant shopping companion, and she's got just a great eye for clothes, and she will help you. And she's also very direct, right? So if you're trying to buy something that will look inappropriate on you, she will not play nice. She will let you know. So, there's one time we're she and Roger in Cape Town, and I come through and we hang out for lunch, and I think we're walking around sort of Simonstown, that stretch. So we go into a shop and we're looking at the clothes, those little sort of shops with, expensive, nice clothes sometimes, but sometimes not very nice. So we look at this outfit, and she looks at it and she goes, "This is hideous." What a hideous thing. And it's a little shop, so the cashier is right there. Looking around, I'm like, "Zoe, we are near the cashier." And she says, "No, but it is hideous. They should be ashamed of themselves. And look at what they're asking for." Because it was ridiculously priced. But her point was it was hideous. And so I find a way to sort of navigate us out of this because I'm embarrassed. And later I tell her, but as we've walked out and we're walking on the streets with her and Roger, and I tell her, but they heard you. And she says, "Well, yes, they should. It was hideous. They should be ashamed of themselves talking that and asking for that kind of money for this." So my point is just, she's direct, but not in a malicious way. I'm sure even the lady must have been embarrassed at, "Oh my goodness, what a direct person." But it's not in a mean-spirited way. But that's my one shopping anecdote that I could share. And I think we were just I felt blessed to have had my paths cross with hers.
And what wonderful advice to the shopkeeper. That would have been so good.